But then otherwise, on behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Esther Bianchi, who is Associate Professor of Chinese Religions and Philosophy, Society and Culture of China, and Chinese Literature at the University of Perugia. She's also affiliated with the big French research institutes, the CNRS and the ETHE, where she received her PhD while at the same time working at the University of Venice. She's currently involved in two big, exciting projects. One of these, together with Daniela Campo, is a study of the Vinaya revival in 20th century China and Taiwan. And it's in connection with that she was at Berkeley for the conference over the weekend. The other of her projects is on the spread of Tibetan Buddhism among Han Chinese. When I first went to China in the early 80s, I don't think I ever met a Han Chinese who expressed any interest in Tibet at all. So I was surprised in the 90s when I was in Taiwan when a visiting scholar told me that the largest source of financial support for the Tibetan community in exile came from Taiwan. And then, since coming back here, every time we have a visiting Tibetan Lama, we pack these rooms with a big room with all of these Chinese visitors that you've never seen before, right? So this transformation from Tibet occupying very little space in the mental imagination of Han Chinese to being so predominant has really been dramatic, and it's taken place over the past, whatever it is, 30 years or so. So today's talk gives us a window onto that transformation, and I think that story is nowhere more dramatic than in the story of the Buddhist Institute that we're going to hear about today. Founded, as far as I know, kind of in the middle of nowhere in 1980, that has grown into what is by all accounts a small city in the past 20 or 30 years. So please join me in welcoming this evening's speaker, Professor Esther Bianchi.
So thank you. I would like to express my gratitude to the Ho Foundation for inviting me here, to Professor Kieschnick, Professor Hartman, to Irene Lin for her kindness and for the organization. Thank you. And of course, I would like also to express my gratitude to my former student, Simona Lazzarini, who I know was the one that pointed out my name. So thank you so much. So today I'm going to speak to you about the Larungar 5 Sciences Buddhist Academy in Settat. The contents are primarily based on information I collected in 2014 and 2015 in the Sichuan area, and also on previous fieldworks in Tibetan areas, mainly in Kham, in Chinese cities, mainly in Chengdu and Beijing, and also in Taiwan during the last decade. This study is going to be published in Fabienne Jagou's edited volume on today's interactions between Tibetan, Taiwanese, and Chinese Buddhism, which is the result of a 3-year research project sponsored by the Jiang Jinghua Foundation on practice of Tibetan Buddhism in Taiwan and China. And so here it is. Of course, since my fieldwork dates back to 2015, it does not take into consideration the most recent events at the Larungar. And if you want, we can discuss about them later. So, the principal objective of my study was that of outlining the spread of Larungar Dzogchen, so a great perfection, teachings among Han Chinese, among Chinese-speaking practitioners, I should say, because some are from the minorities as well, which is a growing phenomenon in mainland China within another very important phenomenon, which is the so-called fever for Tibetan Buddhism that has different aspects, and this one is one of these aspects, and probably the most prominent one. I will focus on Larungar as seen as a place of practice for the Han Chinese. And this is an aspect that has not been deeply studied so far, whilst Larungar, the history of Larungar and its importance for the revival of Tibetan Buddhism in the area has been deeply studied by David Germano, you probably know, by Antonio Terrone, and so on. So mainly by the two of them. David Germano focuses on Tibetan identity connected with the Larungar, whilst Antonio Terrone on treasure revelation there. So today I will introduce Larungar's history and its main characteristics, and that will be the part of the first section of my talk. And then I will try to analyze with you contents and strategies of its teaching activities addressed to the Han Chinese. And in so doing, I think we will see how the notion of ecumenical Buddhism, Rime in Tibetan, we will go back to this concept later, which in spite of its non-sectarian approach is a product of the modern Nyingma tradition. So this concept has been extended by the Larungar masters in order to embrace not only the Tibetan Buddhist schools and movements, but also the Chinese ones. And this is my thesis, the thesis that I'm trying to demonstrate with this study. So, the Larungar Five Sciences Buddhist Academy is located at 4,300 meters above the sea level in the Golok Seta region in eastern Tibet, that is on the edge of the Gansu Tibetan Autonomous Region. You can see it here. This is the Gansu Autonomous Region in western Sichuan. And within Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture of the Sichuan province. It is the largest Tibetan monastery founded in China after the Cultural Revolution and one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in the world. It is so important to point out that it is not the only one. It is probably the most important, the most best well-known, but it is far from being the sole of such Dharma centers in the region. Another very prominent case is Yachangar, which is also a favorite spot for Chinese Dzogchen advanced practitioners. And then we have a number of smaller centers, most of which are unofficial and all around the area, so there are many of them. And some of these centers have been founded by lamas who were trained at the Larungar, so they are very often connected with each other. So it is conceived, I said, as an ecumenical, so non-sectarian Rime place of practice, and its study curricula and its religious activities refer to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as a whole, but at the same time, Larungar teachings and practices reveal a strong Nyingma affiliation, the Dzogchen tradition being its distinguishing feature, and more precisely, most teachings belong to the seminal heart, the Xin Sui tradition of the Great Perfection. So official data of resident monastics were not available at the time of writing, but according to most sources and to my interviews, the place, which is a religious encampment at Sugar, was home to over 10,000 persons at that time. Probably now the scope of the place has been reduced recently. And at least 2,000 of these Buddhist practitioners were Han Chinese. So, and we are going to focus on these Han Chinese practitioners. So Larungar was founded at the beginning of the 1980s by Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok Jimmei Paunsuo in Chinese, a native of Golok, so a native of the same area, and one of the most important Tibetan masters of the modern contemporary era, and also a famous treasure revealer, so a terton. According to his hagiographic accounts, when he was born, he emerged from his mother's womb reciting the Arapatsana heart mantra of Manjushri. And as a matter of fact, Manjushri, the Bodhisattva Manjushri, was destined to play a major role in his practices and teachings. He is also reputed a manifestation of Manjushri himself. At the age of 5, he was acknowledged as a reincarnation of Lerab Limpa Tertön Sogyel, and thereupon he entered a branch of the Pelyul monastery. Just a few biographical data. He took novice vows at 9 years old, when he was 9 years old, and then he became an ordained monk at 22. From 1959, for the subsequent decade, so throughout the Cultural Revolution, he retired and lived secluded in the mountains. Soon afterwards, he created the Larungar encampment in 1980. And during the following 20 years, he attracted tens of thousands of disciples from all over Tibet, but also from all over China, as we have said. And he also visited different places in China and abroad. He has been in Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, in India, where he met the Dalai Lama, in the United States, and I just learned that he came also in this area, and Canada and France. He passed away in 2004 at the age of 71 while sitting in the lotus position, which is usually interpreted as a sign of spiritual realization in the Buddhist tradition. And it is interesting to know that also Nang Hai, who is a prominent Chinese master of the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, is said to have passed away in the same position. So we see it's a topos coming back. So Larungar is sited in a previously inhabited, uninhabited valley. It was initially an informal place of practice, not officially recognized as a religious site by the government. It already it had an explosive growth already during the 80s, and soon became the largest religious venue inside the People's Republic of China. So not only of Tibetan Buddhism, but of all religions in China. The 10th Panchen Lama visited the place in 1986, and the year after, he donated a signboard with the name of the place written in Tibetan. And in 1993, it was the turn of Zhao Puchu, the former president of the Buddhist Association of China, who wrote in his usually appreciated calligraphy the signboard for the place. These two events are important, of course, because in this way the two Buddhist masters leaders gave their formal approval to the academy. And so finally, in 1997, the Bureau of Religious Affairs of Ganzhou Prefecture formally registered the academy as a religious venue under the name of La Rongsi. So you see that the formal name is monastery. So he is registered as a monastery, but it is still organized and managed as a religious encampment. I have to add that the site suffered considerable repressions throughout the years 2000s, but every time it was revived. So, as I told you, even if it in most function it can be considered a monastery, and it is a monastery from a formal point of view, Larungar is still organized as a Chögar, as a religious encampment with decentralized administration and financial self-sufficiency of the majority of its inhabitants. Yes, by the way, most of the pictures that you are seeing are not mine, so the not good-looking ones are mine. The others were taken by a photographer who came with me to Larungar during one of my field works. And you can see in some of them there is also her name, it's Sabina Ragaini. Nowadays the academy is organized in 4 separated sections called the 4 pillars, Seta Zhizhu in Chinese. The first one, of course, is the Institute for Lamas, and here for Lamas it is meant Tibetan monks, so it's the Chinese use of the term Lama that is used. We have then the ANIS, so the Institute for the Tibetan nuns. It was established in 1988 in order to separate the living spaces destined to the ANIS from those inhabited by the Tibetan monks. And it is located down the valley. A few years later, 2 new parts were added. One is the Tibetan, the area for the Tibetan lay people, and the other one, and here we are, is the Academy for the Han Chinese Han Xue Yuan, on which we shall now focus. So the beginning of Jigme Printsok's connection with Han Chinese people can be traced back to the year 1987, when he went on pilgrimage to Wutaishan after a vision of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. Manjushri is said to have recommended him to visit the mountain. He set forth with hundreds of his disciples, and once on the mountain, he gave transmissions and teachings to several thousands of people. And just, I remind you, it's 1987, so it was really pretty early for such an event. And people, for instance, Wen Xinzhou, are convinced of the fact that this event also changed the story of Wutaishan as well. So it was a very a turning point in the history of the mountain. While there, he had other visions of the Bodhisattva. He made a 2-week solitary retreat in the Narayana cave, where on the eastern terrace, where he received new revelations and new texts. He is a treasure revealer, so he was bestowed new teachings and texts from the deities. and he's said to have experienced various miracles and extraordinary events. So many Han Chinese then followed him back to Seta. And Seta immediately became a place of retreat and a pilgrimage spot for thousands of Han Chinese devotees ever since, as this painting at Larungar clearly shows. As you can see here, we have Tibetan monks, but these here are all Han Chinese monks. It is interesting to know that coming back from Wutaishan, when he was in Chengdu, he visited Zhao Jue's temple, and there he met with the Han Chinese Lama Qinding. Qinding was the principal heir of Lama Nenghai, and thus establishing a connection with the followers of the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is another major aspect of this phenomenon of the fever for Tibetan Buddhism in mainland China. So nowadays, Larungar is still a favorite center of practice for Han Chinese people, and this is particularly true thanks to the charisma of a few of his disciples, to their fluency in Chinese and to their readiness to make use of modern media and modern discourses, science and psychology, social issues, current affairs, and so on, which is particularly appreciated by the modernized and often disenchanted Han Chinese middle class. You can see here 4 names. These are the prominent Tibetan heirs of Jigme Phuntsok, who are fluent in Chinese and have many Chinese disciples. I'm not going to speak about Sherad Zampo because he is not anymore at the Larungar. He just left the place and created his own Dharma center in the Ganse region, so we are still in the same area. Sonam Dargye, Tsultrim Lodrö, and the younger Yeshe Phuntsok have been entrusted by Jigme Phuntsok to continue spreading Tibetan Buddhism among the Han Chinese. Sodargye and Yeshe Phuntsok, here you see Sodargye, Suodaji in Chinese, and Yeshe Phuntsok. They are the official teachers of the Academy of Studies for the Chinese-speaking community, so for the Chinese-speaking monastics. They are all monks and nuns who follow the classes at the Academy. Their task is to instruct them in exoteric teachings. On the other hand, Tsultrim Lodrö, he is the dean of the Academy, but he teaches to Tibetan monks there and nuns. He is not a formal teacher for the Han Chinese monastics. Nevertheless, the 3 of them have hundreds and maybe more, thousands, I would say, Chinese followers to whom they transmit tantric transmissions as well. So let us now see some of these religious services who are offered to the Han Chinese. We have, of course, the academy lessons for monks and nuns, tantric transmissions and teachings, and we are going to say something more about the contents of these transmissions in the second part of my talk. Okay. Then the 3 of them often go to China proper or abroad, but also to China proper to lecture at school and universities or to give Dharma talks. And in this regard, the most active is Suodaji, who in recent years has been giving lectures and talks at many Chinese universities. And here you see Tsultrim Lodrö, at a conference, at a series of lectures, Dharma talks he gave in Taiwan when I was there in May 2014, April-May 2014. So due to a clever use of the modern media and to the capability to reach the Chinese book market, and they really do reach the Chinese book market. This is an example at the airport bookstore in Shanghai, July 2015. Sodargie's work, Nizai Manshama, was among the bestsellers of the week. So they are really good at this. So due to this, their influence has gone far beyond the Seta Valley. The works and textbooks produced at Larungar are employed to instruct Han Chinese practitioners in other Buddhist centers, including those located in Chinese cities. And Alison Denton Jones has revealed that in most Buddhist centers in the Nanjing area, they use the Larungar texts. So also not only in Sichuan, but also in those areas, in the Jiannan area. The websites of the most prominent masters are visited by hundreds of Buddhist web users every week, and Sodargie's Weibo has 2 million followers. So as you can see, the scope of the phenomenon is really important. An interesting example of the far-reaching influence of the Larungar tradition is represented by the organization founded by Sodargie in 2006. It was originally called Puti Xue Hui. Now it's called only Xue Hui inside China and still Bodhi Society outside. So it has developed into a network of Buddhist groups located throughout China and connected with the master and the Larungar community via the internet. And it is interesting that, as was the case with the homonymous Bodhi study societies of the first half of the 20th century, which you probably know, its declared aim is that of spreading Tibetan Buddhism among Han Chinese people. So the possibility to follow the teachings on the web, often via webcasting, or to attend a religious center in China proper is probably a major reason for the success of Larungar tradition also among lay practitioners and not only among monastics. In fact, while Han Chinese monks and nuns stay in Seta for the whole year, and very often they stay there for years, even if all the monks and nuns that I could interview told me that they were suffering altitude-related health problems, so they have to leave the place for 1 month once a year, but then they go back. So, on the contrary, not many lay people can do the same. And usually, hundreds and even thousands, as in this case, that is May-June 2015, the Vajrasattva Assembly, more than 1,000 people gathered at Larungar. So usually, I was saying, they gather at Larungar for important meetings, merging into the endless stream of Tibetan pilgrims. Because I don't want to give you a wrong impression, I'm speaking about what I think is a huge phenomenon regarding Chinese devotees, but of course their numbers is far lower, thank you, than the number of the Tibetan practitioners. So the most elaborate, in particular, there are 4 annual grand religious events, and the most elaborated one is the Vidyadharas Assembly, which lasts from the 1st down to the 15th day of the first month of the Tibetan calendar, so it coincides with the New Year celebrations. And it consists in the practice of a terma, a text revealed by Jigme Phuntsok's former incarnation. The Vajrasattva Assembly, which takes place during the 4th month, is and involves a mass initiation, which is also open to Han Chinese practitioners. Is probably the favorite assembly to the Chinese. Han Chinese, they really literally flock to Seta from every part of China. And then we have the assembly of Samantabhadra, and also the Pure Land Assembly is a favorite one because another initiatory ritual takes place also at this during the 9th month of the year. So on these occasions, Larungar Han Chinese Buddhist monastics and lay Buddhists gather together in their own Dharma hall. And the whole community, strictly divided by gender, nuns and lay women on the left side, which is the place where I was, so that's the left side of the hall, and then monks and laymen on the right side, they all participate in the religious ceremonies. So, to conclude this first part of my talk, I wish to share with you the perspective of the Han Chinese practitioners I could interview, and at Larungar and in the surrounding areas, but they were all related to Larungar, and during the 2015 New Year celebrations. Just to understand how this phenomenon is perceived by the practitioners, the Han Chinese practitioners themselves. So among the reasons for their interest in Tibetan Buddhism, most of my interviewees mentioned the role of the master, often defined of great virtue, reputed to be imbued with profound knowledge and spiritual realization, and believed to be constantly and concretely supporting the disciples much more, they usually say, than Chinese masters. Interestingly, a few informants, not only one, I want to say a few of them, even told me that Buddhist masters in Tibet were able to preserve lineages and traditions throughout the Cultural Revolution, whereas lineages and traditions were interrupted in China during that period. An interesting point of view. Then another aspect that was addressed was the need of Han Chinese people to react to the materialistic trend of contemporary Chinese society and to its lack of spirituality and ethics, the very reason for the religious revival that is going on in mainland China, not only for this phenomenon. When I asked monks and nuns what obstacles they believed that Han Chinese disciples would encounter in the practice, they all referred to the lack of confidence in one's root master and to an excessively critical and independent mental attitude, which was indicated as a major cause for unsuccessful outcomes. Then, more from a doctrinal point of view, I acknowledged proximity to Chan Buddhism was advanced as a possible reason for the Dzogchen appeal to Han Chinese people. and as well as the fact that it represents a simple path to realization if compared to the more complex and articulated tantras. And then finally, and obviously, all my interviews, lay and monastics alike, explained that to them Dzogchen is the highest of all Buddhist teachings, the most powerful and the most suitable for the present age of decline. But that is obvious. So, this for the first part of my talk, and I'm going to have some water. And now I will try to consider the actual practices of these Han Chinese studying and practicing Dzogchen at Larungar. So generally speaking, a gradual path is deemed necessary in order to correctly approach the highest teachings. And this is not so much obvious because we are speaking about Dzogchen tradition, but the graduality of the path is very important in the teachings in Chinese language given by the Larungar masters. As a matter of fact, not many Han Chinese people I met during my fieldwork at Larungar and in other centers in the surrounding areas had received transmissions of the instructions into the Supreme Dzogchen teachings. I would say that the majority, and mainly all the lay people, still were bound to preliminaries, which is the minimum requirement to be considered a Dzogchen practitioner. So the gradual path begins from the Sutrayana, we would say, but it is called open or exoteric teaching, Xian Jiao, which is considered preparatory to approach the secret esoteric teachings, the Mi Jiao or Tantrayana. Thus, Larungar masters, as is also the case with the representatives of the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, believe that along the path to realization, one should assimilate exoteric and esoteric doctrines, Xianmi, Ronghe, and they used to say this concept a very traditional phrase, sentence of the Chinese tradition. So this gradualism and the combination of Xian and Mi is also reflected in the Academy's curricula of studies, which are only destined to monastics, as I told you, and to a few lay people. The main classes of the Sutrayana curriculum are focused on Vinaya, Buddhist logic, Abhidharma, Madhyamaka, and Prajna, so the 5 sciences of the name. These are the 5 subjects of traditional Tibetan monastic education for Khenpos and also for Geshen, as a matter of fact. All monks and nuns are also instructed in the Dzogchen preliminaries during these first years of studies, which can be regarded as part of a more esoteric education. But Tantric teachings and Dzogchen advanced practice, on the other hand, are taught in the Mantrayana curriculum, Mi Fa Ke, that can be attended only at the higher degrees and implies initiation. So, as far as exoteric Buddhism is concerned, all Buddhist scriptures and doctrines are worth being studied, particularly those of the Mahayana. As a consequence, it is not uncommon, I would say it is very common, to find references to Chinese Buddhism in Larungar-based masters' works and speeches. For instance, Tsuldrim Lodrö gave lectures about Tibetan Vajrayana and the Chan school, The main point being that Chan, presented as the highest teaching in the Mahayana exoteric tradition, does not seem to be at odds with Tibetan Vajrayana. On the contrary, it is believed to be perfectly in line with some of the core principles of Dzogchen. And this was the content of one of the lectures I could attend in Taiwan. Similarly, Sodargye, between 2013 2014, gave very detailed teachings on the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. Then particular emphasis is given to the Chinese Pure Land teachings, which are often compared to those of the Tibetan tradition. For instance, Yeshe Pintsok has taught Chinese Buddhist texts such as the Sutra of Immeasurable Life, and he also used works by modern Han Chinese master Ying Guan in his lectures, and also other Pure Land related scriptures. And similarly, also Sodargye often teaches the 5 Pure Land Sutras. Finally, recently, the Lotus Sutra was also employed by Sodargye to lecture his Chinese students and disciples. And I cannot really go into details, so I just tell you as a gossip for the time being, but I would like to inquire into it. But what is interesting is that he dared to emendate Kumarajiva's translation, and this aroused a big debate among Chinese Buddhist masters, which was very hot in WeChat. So I have all the WeChat, I have to inquire into that. So, the Chinese exoteric teachings are thus considered as important as exoteric teachings contained in the Tibetan Buddhist canon. And when referring to the latter, sometimes Larungar masters still employ translations produced during the first half of the 20th century by Fa Zun, by Neng Hai, and so on. But most of the works at the basis of the training of the Han Chinese are new translations from the Tibetan or commentaries and didactic works authored by the Larungar Chinese-speaking Tibetan masters. The most fundamental work as far as practice is concerned, is Sodargye's translation of Peltrul Rinpoche's Words of My Perfect Teacher, Pu Xian Shanshi Yan Jiao in Chinese, a guide into the preliminary practices of Dzogchen. The texts on which Han Chinese practitioners can base their practice include some of the classic works of the Nyingma tradition, and particularly texts and termas by the most representative masters of Jigme Phuntsok's lineage that you find listed in this slide. So most of the prayers, hymns, invocations, and basic liturgies, as well as some advanced meditations and practices, are collected in a small volume entitled Larung Daily Chantings, Larung Rechan Ke Song, which is the basis for private practice, daily collective services, and also special celebrations of the religious calendar. A copy of this text is owned by every Han Chinese disciple engaging in the Larungar Dzogchen practices. I have analyzed the contents of this text in depth. I'm not going to share all my considerations with you. I will just give you some general information. So in general terms, it should be noticed that the booklet is written in simplified Chinese characters, which seems to run counter to a growing tendency in contemporary China to employ traditional characters for religious publications. But this is probably due to the fact that simplified characters are easier to be understood not as much by the Chinese practitioners, but by the Tibetan masters. So that's probably the main reason, but that's my hypothesis. For each text, Tibetan and Chinese versions are always provided. And often a Chinese transliteration is also available so as to allow Han Chinese practitioners, most of whom are not familiar at all with Tibetan script. I must say very few nuns and monks study Tibetan language there, so that's interesting to know. So, and the transliteration into Chinese enables them to recite the Tibetan original text instead of its translation. At the beginning of the volume, as you can see from this slide, phonetic instructions to read mantras and Tibetan transliterations are provided. And as it was for the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Nong Hai, it seems that they are using the Sichuanese pronunciation of the characters again. And then we also find this drawing showing the correct layout of texts, images, and offerings on one's own altar for private practices. So for those texts, and this is interesting and probably most interesting for the Chinese scholars in Chinese Buddhism here, for those texts that are already available in Chinese language, previous translations are employed. And you can find here a list of the most representative texts. For instance, the Chinese text entitled 35 Buddha's Confession Prayer is taken from Bodhiruchi's translation from the which dates back to the Tang Dynasty. This same text this is interesting to be acknowledged, is commonly recited in Chinese Pure Land monasteries during evening chanting services. So it is a very well-known and familiar text to Chinese practitioners. As you can see, the ritual of repulsion is taken from Xuanzang's translation of the Heart Sutra. Then we have the chapter of the vows of Samantabhadra, taken from Prajna's Chinese translation of the Gandhavyuha, and so on. I also added here the hymn of Manjushri, which is taken from Nong Hai's translation, just to point to the fact that the inclusion of Nong Hai and Fatsun's translations is further evidence of the seamless bonds between the current spread of Tibetan Buddhism among Han Chinese and the phenomenon of the tantric revival of the first half of the 20th century. So, I said I'm not going into details, but I just wanted to point out that the booklet may be divided in two parts. The first part includes the texts that are central for daily chanting services of the Larungar Chinese community. And these chanting services take place before morning classes and last half an hour. The subsequent part of the booklet, on the other hand, includes liturgies, prayers, and meditations for private practice and for special ceremonies or events. Suffice it to know that that many texts are terma or revealed treasures, and that these practices are scheduled on specific days of this religious calendar and require tantric transmission. The booklet then closes with a tribute to Larungar founder and to its present abbess, Annie Mancuo in Chinese, Chikme Phuntsok's young niece, abbess of the Larungar Nunnery and principal of the Larungar Buddhist Academy. And now I will approach and share with you some of my final remarks. So, at the Dharma lecture, which I could attend, one of those that I could attend in Taiwan, delivered by Tsultrim Ledreux, the master constantly referred to acknowledged Western culture, 西藏文化, usually meaning American culture. That's obvious. You can really understand that to him the West is America, but still it's a Western culture which is imbued with materialism and responsible for turning away Han Chinese people from their own tradition. On the other hand, Confucian thought was presented in line with Buddhism, stating that some of Confucius' mottos could have been spoken by the Buddha himself. A similar message was also at the core of a lecture that the popularity of Tibetan Buddhism in China today, which was given by Sodargye at the He Center of Buddhist Studies at Stanford, so here in November of the same year, so in November of 2014. And it is still available in streaming, so I could follow it. This approach, which is to be found throughout books and materials edited at Larungar, is evidence of the fact that the objective of these Tibetan masters is not to promote Tibetan Buddhism at the expense of Chinese Buddhism, nor at the expense of Chinese culture at all. Rather, what they counter is the modernized, and to them that means westernized, Chinese society. And this is very much related to the fact that, as Dens Meyer Yu has noted, in order to revive their own tradition, Nyingma masters, I quote Dens Meyer Yu, have mostly focused on reconstructing their ruined monasteries and engaging in lineage-based teachings to both Tibetan and non-Tibetans, showing a soteriological intent to globalize Tibetan Buddhism, unquote. In other words, this means that they perceive their form of the Buddhist Dharma not as a seal of identity, which could, for instance, be true for the Gelugpa tradition in mainland China, but it's not a seal of identity based on exclusion. Rather, it is perceived as a powerful and presented as a powerful tool capable of saving the world, and which they are willing to share with other beings, especially with the Han Chinese people. So this, in short, the general discourse that we can find in these teachings. So the present study has shown that Chinese Buddhism is considered part and parcel of the proposed system. In this respect, it is significant that Larungar master often employ the Xianmi category, which is a traditional category of Chinese Buddhism. And to them, Xian refers, so open, sutric, we would say open teachings, refers both to Chinese Buddhism and to a fundamental part of Tibetan Buddhism. So since Xian, open teaching, is considered complementary to and propedeutic of Mi, tantric, Chinese Buddhist doctrines are deemed necessary as much as the Tibetan Sutrayana along the spiritual path. And this allows, as we have seen, this allows Larungar Tibetan masters to make use of previous Chinese translations of the Buddhist scriptures, but also to refer to typical Chan and Pure Land concepts and doctrines. And this strategy is undoubtedly a very good one. Because it makes their teaching more familiar to Han Chinese devotees. So instead of being perceived as different or other, and this is a main difference from my point of view in respect to the phenomenon that was going on during the first half of the 20th century, in this tradition, instead of being perceived as different or other, Chinese and Tibetan forms of Buddhism are integrated within the inclusive Mahayana system. And as such, they are presented as coexisting ab origine and do not need to be merged. In so doing, I believe the scope of the non-sectarian Buddhism, the Rime movement, has been extended in order to include all Chinese Buddhist traditions as well, together with the different Tibetan traditions. So, in addition, and other factors may help explain the fortune of these masters in China, in mainland China, and also in Taiwan. I'm not speaking about this today, but part of my research was focused on the Taiwanese legacy, on the Taiwanese connections. For instance, the relatively relaxed political situation in the area, and I mean compared to other Tibetan regions, this relatively relaxed political situation is also probably derived from the seemingly apolitical attitude of these Nyingma masters, and this is another difference with the Gelugpa tradition. Another factor is the loose organization of the religious encampments, which are capable of offering a remarkably more accessible environment to approach Tibetan masters than is the case in regular monasteries. Another important factor that has already emerged is the capability of Larungar masters, as well as other Chinese-speaking Tibetan masters from the same area, to make use of modern media and technologies, and Antonio Terrone has devoted an entire study to this. And more generally, to speak to Han Chinese in their own cultural language, and I mean this both literally and metaphorically. I'm not only meaning references to Chinese Buddhism or to Confucianism, but also references to the social problems of a modern and globalized world, including the need for environmental protection, the psychological analysis of social distress, the necessity to take care of spiritual needs before the evident failure of a material prosperity to give a happiness. All these are recurring themes in Sultrim Lodreux, Sonam Dargye, and Yeshe Punsok's lectures and works in Chinese. These are clearly addressed, above all, to a middle-class, urban and cultured Han Chinese audience, and would probably not be equally effective if addressed to most Tibetan people. Thank you.
You willing to take some questions?
Yes, I just wanted to say that, as you could see, my English is not that fluent, so that I'm sorry, but I had to read. I hope it was still comprehensible. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So thank you for this interesting and stimulating talk. So I have 4 questions.
4 questions? Okay, I take notes.
The first one is with regard to the names of these Sino-Tibetan monks. So I noticed that there are in most cases the transliteration of their Tibetan names. But I was wondering if in some cases they were not just following to the system of transliteration, but they were consciously choosing some words that had certain resonance to the Chinese audience. Like, for example, the monk Suoji Da. I think that had quite the Da and Ji are both good words in Chinese. So I was wondering if that had any significance. So that's my first question. And then the second one is when you read the lectures of these monks that were given to public middle class Han Chinese or their books that were written for middle class Han Chinese, do you notice a tendency to prefer either of the Kumarajiva era translation or the Xuanzang era translation, so the new Tang Dynasty translation or the middle?
You speak about this about what?
When you
In general?
Yeah, in general,
okay.
is there a
Okay.
tendency
Yes.
to prefer
Okay.
one of
Yes.
those two types of translations? And then the third one was, does Pali and the Theravada Buddhism, does their knowledge of Theravada Buddhism play any role in their discourse on the relationship between Tibetan and Chinese Buddhism? That's my third question. And my fourth question is just a minor one, but so in one of the slides you explained the curriculum of one of the institutions, and you referred to, you mentioned the Sutrayana curriculum, and I noticed that they were missing Yogacara, and they instead had Prajna and Madhyamaka.
Okay.
So I was
Yeah.
wondering what's going on.
Yes, that's interesting. I cannot
Thank you.
answer this question, but that's a question I have myself. But that's interesting you noticed. So, shall I reply? No? Okay. So, as for the transliteration of names, it's nice that you noticed, because I also noticed that, and I'm pretty sure that they have been chosen. And what I can tell you is that they were given to them by, or at the time of the master himself. So Jigme Phuntsok is said to have given the name to them. I cannot tell you more. I haven't found any evidence of of this, but it's quite. What do Chinese people think about this? They really look very nice, do they?
Well, in the Kang region, some of the noblemen, so if they were from a noble family, like in the Qing,
Yeah.
some of them already have a Chinese surname, because they were part of the.
No, but
so
that's
then-
not the point here. Yes, I know what you are speaking about,
So
but
some
here
of
it's
them are
different.
from the
Here it's that they have the transliteration of their own names, but the characters used for transliterating the names, the Dharma names, are nice ones. So they are. They have a meaning. It's not only transliteration, and that was also my impression. I think it's obvious, but I cannot tell you much more about that. But thank you for noticing. I don't think they have any preference for the translations, but they prefer what their Chinese followers prefer. So Kumarajina, that is a major. We know he is very much liked. So I would say, in the case of the Lotus Sutra, Kumarajiva's translation was used, but then you see it depends. So there is not a real choice. I really doubt whether they are very proficient in Wen Yan Wen as well. I'm not so sure about that. With the exception of Sodargye. Sodargye had a very sound Chinese education, so probably. But maybe Professor Kishnik can tell me something more about this. When you know? Okay.
No.
Okay, I thought you might probably have seen texts together. You have not. Okay. But the fact that he emendated and corrected Kumarajiva's text suggests that he is good in Wen Yan Wen as well, and in Chinese Buddhist language. Sorry, not Wen Yan Wen. Then the Theravada Buddhist tradition. Okay, I would love to say yes, because I'm now in the Theravada, in my new field of research regards the contacts with Theravada Buddhism, but I'm afraid it is not so. I have not found any real direct connection with the Theravada or Southern tradition. The connection you find in all those situations where they found themselves together in a Chinese environment where Chinese Buddhist authorities try to try to embrace a Pan-Asian vision of the Buddhist tradition and invite Theravada monks and Tibetan monks as well. I was, for instance, at one of these events in Dali in September, and there were people from Larungar there together with Tibetan monks. Then there were huge amount of Chinese and Japanese monks, and then also many, I think probably 70 or so monks from the Theravada tradition. And in those situations they are together, but I really doubt the Theravada tradition is now a reference for the Chinese Buddhist tradition in many aspects, but I haven't found any. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that? So that are the same sorts of Chinese people who are interested in Tibetan Buddhism, do they also express an interest in Burma and India, kind of in general? Because I think that would be true in the West.
Okay, no. I'm thinking about that. I never. No, I haven't seen. I mean, could be, but it's not so an important phenomenon. I haven't seen this happening. I met many Chinese who are interested in Theravada practice, but none of them also were interested in Tibetan practice. So no. And finally, yes. The study curricula. Okay, here they are. Oh, here they are. No. Here. So I have noticed. I've noticed it as well, of course, and when I asked, they just told me it goes together with Madhyamika, but. I know they study Yogacara, but it's not in the five classes. But yeah, I can maybe someone can answer this last question from Tibetan studies. No, okay. Anyway, they study Yogacara, but it's not written in the study curricula.
We're not in competition. I have more questions than. But I'm the guest, so I'll ask more. Also, he wrote them down. I can't remember them all. It's very interesting. So, this past weekend, you gave a talk at Berkeley that related especially to Taishu, who especially relates to Maitreya. Mm-hmm. And Yogacara is in this Taishu Maitreya sphere of influence. Now you're with Jigme Phuntsok, who's really concerned with Manjushri. I'm going to respond to your question, Sangya, briefly and say I think the Madhyamika and Manjushri go together. And certainly in the Chinese world, nowadays, Yogacara and Maitreya go together. And so these are different spheres. I think that's what's going on.
Could be, yes.
So now my question to you, Esther, is could you talk more about Jigme Phuntsok and Manjushri and so he's considered a manifestation of Manjushri or under the protection of Manjushri, and his teaching, I know he wrote sadhanas on Manjushri and felt guided by Manjushri. Could you talk more about how this affects his teaching and his community?
Okay. His connection with Manjushri, as I said, begins very, very early. And he never said so, but he is said to be a manifestation of Manjushri. You can find it in his hagiography. But then he is recognized as a terton of different traditions, so that goes without a connection with a strict connection with Manjushri. But then the most important of the revelations that he received were received at Wu Taishan or in the small Wu Taishan. There is a small Wu Taishan near Larungar, and our common friend has written about that. So, and they were either revealed, teachings revealed by Manjushri or under the protection of Manjushri. So the Arapatana heart mantra of Manjushri is the mantra that is recited at Larungar. You hear it everywhere. And Manjushri is everywhere at Larungar. So I would say that the community is under the protection of Manjushri. It's clearly linked to Wu Taishan. And this was also very much, but that's my idea, very much used also in terms of relation to the Chinese, because Manjushri is felt as a protector of the Chinese people. So I think all goes together. So basic meditation is on Manjushri, and there are sadhanas on Manjushri, and the highest teachings are also are connected to Manjushri. So yes.
So in a sense, although he's culturally foreign compared to Han, there's this very close link.
Yes.
Which is Wu Taishan Manjushri.
Yes.
That really opens the door. And I mean, I think, to me, that seems very important.
Yes. Yeah, that's what, that is what I was pointing to. I'm not saying that it was done on purpose, but it has been very, very useful, of course. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
This time I want to ask before the food is ready. Lots of questions. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. And I tried to condense them to two. Jigne Pünsogi said he was a terton, treasure finder.
Mm-hmm.
What did he find? Texts? If so, in which language? Chinese or Tibetan? Or was it cultic objects that he found? This is the first question. And the second has to do with this Rime movement, which is, as far as I can see it, which always has been a rather open concept. There is no school like Iluk, Kagyu or something like that. And it was very prominent, probably developed in eastern Tibet in the 19th century. And for my feeling, my understanding, there's a certain, I hesitate to call it anti-Gelug undertone to this movement, but this is maybe something we could discuss later. But the question, in this 19th century Tibetan movement, the Bempo, there was an important Bempo figure participating.
Yeah.
Does that play any role in do the Bempos, are they still present? Are they, did you ever hear this word, or any reference to teachings?
Okay. I don't find it. It's okay. It's okay. He was terton and finding texts in Tibetan, not in Chinese. He translated texts. Yes.
That was before Larung.
That's again, that's something that happens all the time, and I try to say this, but then it's obvious that it turns out to be a little bit unbalanced. again, he was a Tibetan master. He was teaching in Tibetan. His writings were in Tibetan. He didn't write in Chinese. His disciples do, but he was translated at that time. So yeah, but then it
was
comes.
It was
Yeah.
texts. Do you know to which cycle?
I have all here.
Okay.
Please don't let me
No.
speak Tibetan. It's not, but I have all the texts I can show you, and yes, there, yes, okay. And as for the Rime, no, not okay. Not in this tradition. I haven't seen any Bumpo influence or relation or contact in this very tradition. But there might be, because of what you were saying, that at the very beginning, this ecumenical, or I don't know how to, non-sectarian, I never know how to translate it. This Rime approach was so widespread that also regarded Bumpo. So yes, but here I haven't found. So
Could I ask another question about this Rime approach? And you've said how they've adapted to some extent to Chinese Buddhism. They accept it. They use Chinese translations. But I also found it very interesting that you said that very few Han Chinese actually learn Tibetan.
yes.
So what I want to get clear here, are we looking at a kind of dual system, right? Where the Tibetans do the Tibetan thing, and on the other side the Tibetans do, they present a curriculum that is geared towards the Chinese. And what interests me is whether any of the Chinese material influences anything that the Tibetans are doing. Do you see the point of the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Or whether they just go on doing what they've always done, but in the Chinese hall, they're doing something quite innovative and creative and mixing things up.
Okay. It's more complicated than how you put it. It's like this. My thesis is that these Tibetan masters have extended the Rime concept to Chinese Buddhism as far as their teachings toward Chinese Buddhists are concerned. This does not affect the curricula of Tibetan monks and nuns or lay practitioners at all. And so we really have two different systems going on. I was so surprised when I found out that they were not studying Tibetan at Larungar. I just gave it for granted. Before going there the first time, I only was with lay people, and that was normal to me that they were not studying Tibetan, but I was sure that at the academy they would, and they are not. And this is clear. This clearly reveals that they don't really feel part of the whole. They are just an exception there, and they feel themselves like this. They do behave this way. When I was there, I just was asking some of the nuns if they wanted to join me to the Ani Gompa, because in the Ani Gompa there was this big event, and they were like, "No, we don't never go there." And I said, "Why?" So it is very separated, and I told you that it's more complicated because the curricula of Tibetans, Tibetan monks and nuns, are not those that I have explained to you. They are more deep. They're more deep. They are much more demanding. One of my informants is following all the years, and it's a lot of years, 8 I think, to get to the Kempo title, and they have exams. It's much more demanding, and they have of course, much more tantric practices. And what it happens usually is that if you speak to them, to the Tibetan monks and nuns, about the Chinese practitioners, they have kind of derisory attitude, just like, oh yes, but they do not get what we do. So it's kind of, so there is also kind of competition, and it's very separated. Yeah, so.
Because that would be really interesting if some of the Han Chinese practitioners were able to cross over and study as Tibetans. I mean, I see many analogues here with what goes on in the West with Western practitioners and Tibetans, and the kind of teachings that the Dalai Lama gives when he's speaking Tibetan to Tibetans and the ones he gives to when he's speaking English to a wider audience.
It is exactly the same. So I met some, no nun, but some Chinese monks who had studied Tibetan and were following the Tibetan classes. But just a few, no nuns, just a few, yeah. But it's not the phenomenon I was speaking about. It's really different. I completely agree. It's very mindful of what is happening in the West, and is and I really think it's a new form. It is a new form of Chinese Buddhism. I say it's low because I know it could seem strange, but yeah, it's very separated from the Tibetan environment there and Tibetan teachings.
Cool. So it seems like these teachers have considerable support among Chinese monks and nuns, but are there any groups that you're aware of that openly criticize this fever of Tibetan Buddhism?
Among Chinese people?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Monks and nuns?
Yes, many,
Yeah.
many. Yes.
And where does that
In different ways. I don't know whether you are familiar with the work by Shan Weirong. He wrote something about the persistence of prejudices among Han Chinese people against the Tibetan Buddhism, and I would say that many prejudices are still there. So I would, just to answer you, I would say that there are two basic different reactions. There is the reaction of the Chinese Buddhist Sangha, and there you find some masters who are, have this Pan-Asian vision, I would call it, and they are more cooperative, and many masters that really simply don't like it, and they might also feel somehow in danger, because it's really a growing phenomenon. So the numbers I was quoting are really can be felt with fear. I can understand that. So, and that's one part. And from this point of view, there is a very popular Chinese Buddhist website in Taiwan. I don't really recall the name, but it's. I can, if you are interested, I can send it to you. Where all the Tibetan Buddhist traditions are criticized from a doctrinal point of view, and very heavily criticized, and that's first part. And on the other hand, there is also a reaction by the common people against that. So on the one hand, there is this phenomenon of this fever for Tibet, which also involves the religion, and it does involve religion more and more. It didn't at the very beginning, but now it does. On the one hand, and so that which makes things easier for me. For instance, when I first went to China for my first field work in Tibetan areas was in 1995, and all my Chinese friends were like, no, don't go there, it's dangerous and everything. And now everybody's find it so nice and cute that I study Tibetan Buddhism. So things have changed. But on the other hand, there are still some prejudices against Tibetan Buddhism going on. Mijiao is felt as something magical and not so easily understood and so dangerous, probably. Then the sexual prejudices that date back to the Yuan dynasty, actually, but they are still there. So, for instance, in Ma Jian's novel, Stick Out Your Tongue, or something like this, you can find them there. It's obvious that he's describing lamas having sex with women on the border of a river and everything. So this, and then so the Mijiao part, the magic part, the sexual part, and it is interesting that in these places I could visit Yabgyum representations, so representations of deities in sexual union, or representations of the phallus of the deity and so on, are covered. So that's something that reminds us of the fact that they have different sense of decor, I would say. And then the third one is the use of repellent, wrathful images and offerings. For instance, Tibetan Buddhism has the offering of the five, I don't remember how to say this in English, sorry. The five offerings, anyway, which also comprehend blood and shit and so on. So, and that's something that is not really well accepted. And then the fourth one, the fourth aspect of Tibetan Buddhism that is often criticized is the central role of the Lama, of the master. So on the one hand, it is probably one of the major reasons of the favor of the fortune of this Tibetan Buddhism among Han Chinese, but on the other, it is felt it's like a fourth jewel. It doesn't seem very orthodox. So
would you be willing to say that those kinds of reactions are getting stronger and stronger as time goes on with these successive places like Falun Gong? Or is it kind of counterweighted by?
No, I think no. I'm never good in saying what's going to happen. So,
Kind of
but
too big of a question.
yeah, but I would be surprised if it happened. I would be surprised. It's really a growing phenomenon, and you can see it in Taiwan, for instance. Sorry, you can see in Taiwan. In Taiwan, it was really a small one, and now it's blooming. It's thriving. So. Sorry.
I was going to say that I have 4 questions. I know that Dee has a question, but we've already kept our jet-lagged speaker talking for an hour and a half, so maybe we can continue the conversation downstairs with some food and something to drink, but not before thanking her one more time.
Thank you. Thank you.